am again. You think that I could sense a trend?
TV's weird. So I have this podcast called Someday Will Be Syndicated. I haven't updated it in a very long time. In fact, my best friend Megan and I started an entirely separate podcast, like on the RSS feed, about the history of fandoms in the meantime since I last actually updated Someday Will Be Syndicated. Emily and Megan are fandom laureates, ran for 3 seasons, whatever that means in podcasting. We put a stupid amount of work into it. It's pretty fun. You can still listen to it, but the original podcast is coming back. Megan is gonna co-host it with me. I was originally just a single host, like a fool. I just wanted to talk about TV into the ether. So now Megan is gonna be my co-host on Someday Will Be Syndicated, and we're gonna talk about pilots and like, do they work for any given show? I think it's gonna be fun. So anyway, the title Someday Will Be Syndicated came from the fact that I really like the history of syndication in the same way that I like the concept of pilots, but like different a little bit because, you know, pilots still functionally exist but are still changing, so that's a whole thing that I will be talking about in a moment. But syndication is, as the title of this video kind of bluntly states in a clickbaity way, dying, sort of. We'll talk more about it. Pilots and syndication aren't the same by any means, but they are both super cool, kind of weird, and are slowly becoming outdated in a way, or at least the way I was taught about them is becoming outdated, and technology is moving so fast that there was no way for, in the 6 years since I graduated, any of my professors in film school could have actually prepared me for what the landscape looks like right now, which is really cool, and I love that I spent so much money on film school for that reason alone. But what I think is kind of interesting about syndication and pilots and kind of them changing / going out of vogue within the industry is that they both still very much exist and are still kind of integral parts to the engine of television, just either differently or rebranded, making less money, ? They both live in this strange space of being phased out by most networks, at least like number-wise, and still being major things that you either need, in the case of a pilot, or need to have a plan for, in the case of like a show bible or a pitch deck that will help with, here's what it would look like if we got to syndication, when you're selling the show, regardless of who you're pitching it to. So like the original concepts don't exist, except for the few cases where they exist with broadcast television. But you still need the things that would have created those. I just also find it fascinating because syndication was like the biggest way that people made money in television if they didn't work at the networks. And sometimes if they did. Like I said, TV's weird. Okay, so I'm gonna start with pilots, mostly to get it out of the way, but also because of the two things, pilots actually hasn't changed how it works all that much. Like, you still need a pilot. Pilots are the first episode of a show. They have to exist. So it doesn't really matter if the show is going to be on cable, network, or broadcast. You still need to actually have a pilot in order to get that show made, regardless of like what happens after you go, hello, I have a pilot. The pilot is really interesting because a lot of people, and this is like kind of hearsay, think that the term of calling the first episode of a show the pilot is this idea of the pilot ship, that like pilot ships are smaller ships that tow in bigger ships to shore. And so the idea, at least as I was told in film school, and this is like completely like hearsay, but the idea is that the pilot episode of a show is that little ship, and it's bringing the big ship, which is the rest of the show, which will hopefully go into syndication, to shore, aka the network, you know? It's a metaphor, but regardless of where it gets its name, pilots are the first episode. They're where you meet leads, antagonists, where you deal with setting, and where you kind of understand the game of the show, and then how the show functions within that game, like what's the smaller subset genre that the show fits in. Like, is it a drama or a comedy? And then there are trees that branch off when you look at drama, comedy, you have procedural, you have family, you have like all of these sort of like things, workplace comedy, workplace drama, etc. So like your pilot is going to tell you, even just kind of based on length, what tree you're kind of dealing with, and then you get into the nitty-gritty of it as you write the actual episode or as people actually read the episode. It's also important because budgetarily, you should have all the things that are going to make up the language of your show in the pilot. So if you are going to use flashbacks or VO, or say do an animated version of your lead to cut to, or if you're gonna do like Monster of the Week and you need CGI, like all of those things that you're planning on having in the show should appear in the pilot, both so that the person who's reading it just to like kind of read it for, will this work for us, understands what you're doing, but also so that budgetarily they know, well, what is the show going to cost on a week-to-week basis based on the kind of language that they're using without us having to actually make the show yet. Is it going to be an expensive show or a cheap show? So usually a pilot will get ordered. Well, I mean, this used to be the case. It's a whole thing. But the idea was that somebody would go in and pitch the show using the pilot and either a show Bible or a pitch deck, depending on, you know, what the actual execs wanted to see and also how much detail the person pitching is going to go into. Usually I think that has to do with if they have an overall deal or if they're just kind of going in for a general meeting kind of thing, you know? It just depends on what your situation is. So when you're trying to get a show made normally, you would go in to pitch for execs during what is deemed as pilot season, at least, again, how it used to be on broadcast. So this is when all of the major kind of broadcast networks and the cable networks that broadcast owns are looking for new shows to fill out their next year's slate. However, streaming and a lot of cable doesn't necessarily run on the same schedule as broadcasting or the cable networks that broadcast owns. So like premium cable and streaming kind of will sometimes have a similar schedule, but they kind of take pitches year round versus like regular cable that broadcast owns and broadcasts tend to have like a very specific time frame that they usually take pitches for to do this thing that I'll talk about in a moment, which I understand, but I also think is batshit. It's wild. TV is so weird, y'all. So because broadcast and the cable networks that broadcast owns are kind of the only ones that really use this system the way that I was taught that the system worked, a lot of shows instead get ordered straight to season instead of doing this like, we're ordering the pilot and then we'll see if we like it, and if we like the pilot then we'll order the show, which I'll talk more about in detail in a moment. But I also want to say that like that process is why a lot of times when you watch a show, the pilot feels so different from the rest of the show, and it's because they shot the pilot usually months before they shot the rest of the show, and it also has like much less collaborative effort put into it from like a writer's room, which gets established after, so then like the arcs get decided and all of these things. So that's why pilots sometimes feel a little bit different than the rest of the show, and it's because it's like one person shot months ahead and they usually don't reshoot pilots. I mean, they do, but they usually don't. Like, they have been known to. Usually it has to do with casting. So like the reason that cable, like premium cable and streaming networks are able to kind of just like take rolling pitches is because that they can kind of do whatever they want, because they're not bound to make money the same way that broadcast and cable networks owned by broadcast networks are. Like, they're not doing stuff based on ad revenue because they don't have ads, which really frees up the whole system, you know? So this is what I mean when I say that pilots don't really function the same as before. Like, on broadcast and regular cable, yes, they function exactly the same. Hasn't really changed a lot, at least to my knowledge. Like, there are maybe some changes to how shows get picked up or the kinds of stuff that they're doing with the people who have overall deals, but for the most part, it's pretty much the same. However, streaming and premium cable are making more shows than they either were before or combined more than broadcast, which there are just more streaming networks and platforms and premium cable platforms than there are broadcast networks. It's just a fact. It's math. In fact, I've even heard from a few people that streaming and premium cable are looking more so for pilots and pitch decks or show bibles, which totally normal. And then also maybe the second episode of the show. Like, if you're not gonna order a pilot and actually shoot it before you order the whole show, you want to be able to see what the second episode from that person would look like, which I think is smart, but is, you know, also kind of hard as a writer. Now, I don't actually know how true that is because, like, I'm not pitching, but I wouldn't be surprised if it is based on, like, the models that exist for cable, like premium cable and streaming, and also what's going on with COVID and how the industry is, like, trying to figure out what it's doing. It would make sense to be able to know if you're buying something that it's a sure shot, or as sure a shot as you possibly can without having to, like, pay that person to write the whole show. So it makes sense to me, but I don't know if that's 100% true right now. Okay, so classically, aka on broadcast, here is how a show gets made. Someone pitches the series, usually with a pilot, but not always if they have an overall deal. If the execs like it, then they will order just the pilot. They'll be like, hey, go make the pilot. They essentially treat it as a short film. They do all the pre-production work that they need and they shoot the damn thing as if it is a standalone piece of media. And then kind of towards the end of pilot season, the execs watch back all of the pilots that they ordered and kind of decide if they're gonna pick them up. And this can be a number of episodes, like if a show gets picked up, it can be a variety of episode numbers based on the network, the actual show itself, and sort of what it would look like in the programming block that already exists on the network. So that could mean that the show starts in the fall with either a full or a partial order. Again, those numbers can be like a variety of numbers, and often shows will get ordered in like 10 or 13 episode pieces, and then you get like a back 9, or you get like 3 additional episodes. Like, it ranges and it's wild and like it doesn't make any sense to me, but like it's how it works. And it seems like it would be hard to plan a show, but I mean, if you're doing broadcast, you're probably doing a more episodic-y thing, so it's probably a little bit easier on that front. Versus like streaming and cable, it's much more of like, it is one cohesive story, please tell me exactly how many episodes I have. So basically it could start in the fall with any number of episodes, or it could be a mid-season replacement for any fall show that performs badly and gets canceled before Christmas. RIP. Okay, so I've been talking a lot about broadcast, and broadcast is basically made up of 5 networks. You have ABC, NBC, Fox, CBS, and the CW. Those are it. Like, it's just the 5. And then those networks tend to own a bunch of cable networks, your TBSs, your FXs, that kind of stuff. And then you have premium cable like HBO, Starz, Showtime, and streaming like Netflix, Hulu, which is still owned by a bunch of corporations and has a lot of streaming deals, so like it is its own thing and it also isn't. Confusing. Amazon, etc. So if you were on broadcast, the dream was to have 22 episodes a season and run for 5 seasons. Like, that was part of the pitch. Like, here's the pilot, here's the idea I have for season 1, and here's a vague but like pretty well thought out idea I have for the next 4 years. Like, here is the full 5-year plan. This is because, well, like, A, you want to know that the person that you're buying a show from actually has like a thought on where it's going and what's gonna happen, and like that they're not so set in stone that it wouldn't change, but that they have a plan, you know? But 2, and I think that this is like more important, especially when you're talking about like syndication, which is what I have gracefully moved into talking about instead of pilots. If you have decided that that show is worth spending all the money on to like buy and invest in for 22 episodes a season for 5 seasons, if you do that, you then hit a magic number, which is 100. 100 is the traditional threshold for TV to hit syndication. Hey! It means that you can do reruns of that show for 20 weeks, doing a Monday through Friday, 1 episode a night, airing without repeating an episode, which is about half a year. So that's half a year of programming that a network can package and sell to other like cable networks, or sometimes even other like broadcast networks. It's very strange. Don't really understand how it works, that they can sell to fill out that network's programming block, and that network doesn't have to spend the money which would usually be much more expensive, or time, also expensive, to make that show. You're giving a prepackaged show to another network and being like, hey, if you give me this amount of money, you can air it and you don't have to fucking make a new TV show. And that's valuable. That's like insanely valuable. And that's what syndication is. It's reruns. So like the history of syndication is kind of murky, and it's mostly because the history of television and the rights of television can get really convoluted because of where the money comes from and who owns the rights to things and how technology has evolved. So like 100 episodes was always the goal, but the first show that was specifically made for syndication to like hopefully be in syndication and be sold as a syndicated show was the show called Life with Elizabeth in the 50s, and that show ended up having 65 episodes. Not 100. I mean, it went into syndication, but it only had 65 episodes. It was also at a time when, instead of 22 episodes a season, most seasons were more like 30 plus episodes, which is wild. So while you think when I say the number 65, if you kind of do quick math, that show maybe ran for like 4 years, it actually only ran for 2. I don't know why they tried to push out 30 episodes a season. That seems exhausting. By the way, Life with Elizabeth starred Betty White and Del Moore and was sort of like a comedy sketch show where they played the same characters in every sketch, which, cool. So more recently, it's more like 88 episodes for syndication, aka 4 seasons of 22 episodes, so they like dropped it down a season because TV is kind of expensive to make when you're doing that many episodes and paying that many people. But you actually only need 50 episodes of television to syndicate it by putting it on demand, which I think is weird and fascinating, and I really don't understand how that works, but the minimum goal for syndication is 50 episodes, but the dream goal is at least 88. However, they still ask you for a 5-year plan when you pitch a show, and you should still put a 5-year plan into your pitch, because the more episodes you have, the more you can bargain with other networks for syndication rights, which is literally how most people make their money in television. Like, do you want to know why the cast of Friends or Cheers or Seinfeld or The Big Bang Theory are really rich? It's because of syndication. Not to mention a bunch of shows kind of do better in syndication than they did in their original airing, which I kind of really love and think is super interesting. It's how I saw, though they were edited, and I did not know that they were edited at the time, episodes of Sex and the City without having HBO as a kid, which is interesting because that's not a thing HBO does anymore. They don't syndicate for other networks, even ones they own, which fascinating. And it's because of streaming, but we'll talk about it in a moment. But shows doing better in syndication is why we have 7 different shows set in the Star Trek universe, and only one of them ran for less than 3 seasons. It was the animated show, by the way, and it only ran for 1, and I'm eternally sad about it. I will say, though, that I've noticed that generally if a show is in syndication and becomes more popular in syndication, that it tends to be a drama, not a comedy, that dramas become more popular, and comedies tend to have already been popular. I don't have a thought for why that is, but I just think it's neat. Okay, so the death of syndication? Yeah, I would say it's happening, but it's also like not happening. It's weird because syndication is probably still very much alive and well for broadcast networks and like normal cable networks for people who have like cable, but like a lot of people don't. Syndication has evolved because a lot of people don't have TV, they just have internet. In this digital streaming age, it's no longer TBS or Adult Swim buying syndicated episodes of Fox's Family Guy and me watching those episodes completely out of order, not understanding any like jokes that are references to things that happened in other episodes of the show, which, you know, like same deal with Futurama, which is a show that I love, but I am pretty sure I've still never seen in order because of syndication. Instead, syndication in like a modern era and like streaming platforms and cable is more like HBO Max, which is HBO's new streaming network that's part streaming, part just like kind of a general Turner network vault of a kind, buying the rights to stream Friends for $425 million. And I'm gonna say that I am 99.9% sure that those are not streaming rights till the end of time. Like, those streaming rights are for a very specific amount of time, and I bet that it ends sooner than we all think. My whole thesis, such as it is, for this video is basically that syndication is dead, and streaming rights is standing over the body, Among Us style. I just walked up to the body and I saw streaming rights walking in the other direction, so it's gotta be them. Like, Netflix was willing to pay $90 million to keep the streaming rights to The Office, but they were outbid by, let me check, oh yeah, the network that fucking aired the show originally. Allegedly, NBC Universal offered to pay $100 million a year to stream The Office. It's putting it on Peacock, which is NBC's streaming platform. So why did NBC, the network that The Office originally aired on, have to pay to stream a show that they aired originally? Well, TV is weird. So many companies are responsible for putting the funding together to make a show happen. So it's not as easy as saying that like NBC aired it and maybe paid to make some of it, and therefore they have the rights to do whatever they want with that show once it's done. There are contracts in place, and what's fun is that a lot of those original contracts didn't say anything about streaming. They have no clause about streaming or streaming networks or platforms or anything. An example I can use that is related to streaming is that like a show pays to use music, and they pay to use that music in very specific ways. Usually it's during airing, during syndication, so reruns, and home video. So when you buy the show on DVD or VHS if you're really old, like me. I mean, I mostly bought stuff on DVD, but I think we had some VHS TV shows. Anyway, then that show could retain the music because they had already paid for the rights to put the music in on those specific like platforms of being able to view the show. But nobody knew that streaming was going to just like happen, and so it didn't get written into contracts. So when a show goes onto the streaming platform, they usually have like one of two things they can do. They can either negotiate for new rights for the original music, which tends to be pretty expensive and time-consuming, or they can just replace all of that music, which ends up usually being cheaper. So most shows opt to just replace all the music. Basically, to quote Cher Horowitz, it's a big old mess. Okay, so not to railroad this into like a different direction, but it is my video, and it's something that I think is kind of tied up in all of this, and like as a writer who's like trying to break into TV, I think about this a lot and why I think it's related, and that's the idea of spec scripts. So like I don't think that spec scripts or the decline of spec scripts is like a cause of like the death of syndication or like the rise of streaming rights or anything. I think it's more like it's a symptom of streaming platforms and of sort of like what's going on with streaming rights and syndication. People mean two different things in the industry when they talk about spec scripts, which is like fun and slightly confusing. In film, it generally means a script that somebody has written without being asked to write it. So like if you have a screenplay that you've written, that's a spec script, and you wrote it without being asked to, with the intention of getting it in front of somebody who might, you know, make it for you or like fund you making it. And like that's what spec scripts are in film. Everybody has them. It's what most scripts in film are. So in television, spec scripts are never made, or at least like they aren't made anymore. They also aren't really looked at anymore. Like they're still important to have, and like people will ask for them, but not first. They're like good to have, but not necessarily need to have. In television, spec scripts are an episode of an already existing, still running TV show that you have written. Or like someone has written it, doesn't have to be you, I guess. But like spec scripts are written for like one of two major things. One is that like you're trying to prove that you can write in the voice of a show. So like if a showrunner is reading a spec script to kind of figure out if they want to staff you, they want to know that you can write in the voice of any show. It's important if you're going to be a staff writer, because you're not going to be a showrunner. Like you're not dictating the tone of the show that you're being a staff writer on. And they want to know, or like it was important for them to know, if you could write in the voice of that show. The second thing is to prove that you're a good writer. It's the same thing as like if you're submitting a pilot, like you want to show that you can write, whatever that means to whoever is reading it. So the next biggest thing about spec scripts in television is that the show that you're writing the spec script for, no one from that show is ever going to read that script. They can't it's a legal issue. Now, this wasn't necessarily always true. Like most things, all roads lead back to Star Trek, and they used to have like a pitch program where you could just pitch a spec episode of Star Trek, and if they liked it, they would just buy it from you and either rewrite it with a staff member or have you rewrite it, and you would just like be staffed for a single episode of Star Trek. And that was cool, but that was in the 90s and the early aughts, and they don't do that shit anymore, much to my sadness. Like, let me write on Star Trek, you cowards. However, all of that is to say that the fanfic episode of the show that you're writing is not that big of a deal anymore. So like, it used to be the thing you had. You had a pilot as like a secondary, but you wanted to make sure that you had a spec script that was current and relevant and polished and good, because the spec script is what got you hired. And the pilot was like flavor text. So right before I graduated from college, spec scripts completely ruled the game. So I was like 7 years ago. In the last decade, however, it's actually more important to have pilots. Everybody's kind of shifted to, I want a pilot or 2 pilots, and that's what I want to read from you to see if I like your writing. And I understand why this is, and a big part of it, I think, has to do with streaming and how many more television shows there are just kind of in the world. So like, you can still write spec scripts and people still read them, but it's not going to be the first thing they ask for, and you're only really doing it to kind of fill out your portfolio or to enter screenwriting fellowship contests, which even those are kind of changing to where like a lot of them don't want specs at all. They want either a single pilot in place of the spec that they used to ask for, or they want 2 pilots instead of the pilot and the spec that they asked for. So like, even the TV fellowship programs are kind of changing with the times, though they're kind of the last ones to do that. But I will say that because of the thought that the spec script needs to be of a show that's currently on air, spec scripts tend to age rather quickly, especially in this time of streaming where most shows barely make it out of season 2. Which is a big reason why I think that this is all related. There's a rise in want for pilots because shows die too quickly for specs to be worth a whole lot. I think there's also this sort of like business of there are too many shows, and so you can't expect someone who is running a show and probably has a family to be able to be as like up on every show and like know it well enough to know if this person is writing an episode of that show in the voice of that show. Like, pilots just have a much easier barrier to entry if you're looking at it from like a time and like brain space capacity of the person who's trying to hire people, which I think makes a lot of sense and I think is cool. Just, pilots are really fucking hard to write and write well. At any rate, I think this video kind of more so came from like, I'm trying to break into the TV industry in Los Angeles, and I'm just thinking a bunch about all of that, clearly. And I think that the history of TV is absolutely fascinating and evolving so quickly that like, what is gonna be relevant when I actually am able to get to pitch? Who knows? It's truly a mystery to me. Another thing I've been thinking a lot about, because, you know, we've been in quarantine for like 7.5 months, you know, is that like, how I thought the industry worked and how I was taught that the industry worked is so much more different than how I know it to actually work now. That fault doesn't lie with my professors, and it doesn't even lie with like the professionals who I watch and adore and like listen to, who are so open about their careers and how they broke into the industry, but they haven't had to work as writer's assistants or post PAs or, you know, writers PAs in so long that literally syndication died. Like, what? So like, none of their advice is like, it's like nice to know, but it doesn't really like help me in like a truly applicable way. I don't really have a conclusion for this video, but I'm just really interested to see kind of what pitching is like soon, both in general, but also post-COVID, because like, who knows? Like, literally no one knows what's happening to the industry right now. And also, if streaming platforms who like make their own content as well as host content in sort of a syndicated fashion, aka streaming rights, end up basically having those streaming rights replace traditional syndication, like, what does that mean? Because it's not like Netflix is gonna let Adult Swim or TBS run Stranger Things, even for a fee. Like, it's just not gonna happen. Like, there is a whole host of shows that will only ever live on the network that they were made on the streaming platform or the premium cable network that they were made for, but can be viewed whenever you'd like because of the nature of that platform. Like, there's no need to have any specific number of episodes to fill out a programming block on streaming or even really premium cable. It exists more on premium cable, but certainly not on streaming. People used to make their money in syndication. That's why people always said you should get into TV. It's where all the money is. Because if you made a show that went into syndication, everybody who worked on that show usually made bank. And if that show was like popular enough, like Friends or The Office, you kept making bank because you would get money anytime an episode of it aired, as well as a cut of the syndication money. Residuals were huge, and still are, a huge way that people actually make money in the film and television industry. Mostly in the TV industry, but sometimes in the film industry. And I think that's kind of happening less in streaming. Like, I think people are making less money because they still haven't quite figured out what it means to have reruns and how to do residuals on a streaming platform for a show that exists for a streaming platform. A lot of people in like the WGA have been fighting about for a while. People want their residuals and they're trying to figure out what that means in the era of streaming. How are the people who make shows that only exist on Netflix and will never exist anywhere else supposed to make the kind of money that they would have made if that show existed on ABC and went into syndication? I think the current answer is that they just don't. Anyway, Megan and I are bringing back Someday We'll Be Syndicated, which is a podcast about TV, and we're gonna talk about pilots specifically, and you know, maybe we can also kind of talk about all of this because it's fascinating, both from just like a historical point of view and also from like a personal point of view as someone who wants to like get into it and kind of wants to know what they're getting themselves into. I'm not saying that streaming killed syndication. I'm just saying that it was following it around the ship, acting kind of sus. I'm not accusing, I'm just stating a fact.